Mr. Richard Wike, thank you so much for joining our program. You are Director of Global Attitudes Research and Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. 38 nations across the globe you analyzed in your last report on public opinion toward democracy and civil liberties. My first question to you would be whether the democracy is an outdated or an overrated system.
Well, I don't think it's outdated if you look at the data we received from people around the world. There's a lot of interest in key democratic rights and institutions. We asked people about things such as free media, freedom on the internet, free speech, having honest, competitive elections, freedom of religion. On all these things, we see majorities across the world saying these things are important to have in our society. So there's a lot of demand for a lot of the key principles of a democratic society in regions across the world.
Would this research have had different results if it were made today after the attacks in Paris?
Well, of course, it's hard to predict, what would happen if we conducted the survey today. Certainly, events can influence how people answer questions. If people perceive a threat from a different group, for example, they may perceive that group differently. Their ideas about tolerance may change. So it's certainly possible. From our point of view, what we want to do is we want to keep doing surveys on these topics and see if they change and measure how people's attitudes shift over time depending on what's happening in the world.
Speaking about democracy and not democracy, what triggers, in your view, the emergence of anti-democratic movements like the Islamic State?
Well, if you're talking about anti-democratic movements, in many ways they're going to be out of step with public opinion in many of the countries we surveyed because, we see across all sectors of society some interest in, at least in some of the key features of democracy. So, again, from our data's point of view, democracy is something people want.
You mentioned Ukraine as one of the countries where the brutal political changes and the war, I would add, have changed people's perception regarding democracy. Please detail this for us, the data on Ukraine.
Sure. So in Ukraine, we see a little bit lower prioritization of some features of democracy than we see, say, elsewhere in Europe. Part of it could be that Ukraine obviously has a lot of other things happening in that country right now, and people in Ukraine are facing a lot of challenges, and other issues may be higher priorities. So those could be some of the reasons why we see lower prioritization of certain features of democracy in Ukraine compared to elsewhere in Europe, certainly. But at the same time,
such as?
Well, free expression, democratic rights and institutions.
Is not a priority for them.
Well, it's a lower priority for people in Ukraine, I think, than elsewhere in Europe. So, again, you see people saying that these things are important nonetheless in Ukraine, but the percentage of people who maybe say they're very important is lower in Ukraine than you might see elsewhere in Europe. So it's not that people don't want these things, but in terms of asking them about what their priorities are and making it something they see as being very important to have in their country, you may see lower numbers there compared to some of the other countries we see, some of the other results we see in Western Europe.
Applies this also in Russia?
Same is true in Russia, where you see, again, compared to other countries in Europe, a little bit less support for some of these democratic rights and institutions. Again, you see Russians saying these things are important to have in their society, but in terms of making it a priority, saying it's very important, the numbers there are a little bit lower.
Mm-hmm. What would be the explanation?
Well, I think that it could again be that other things are more important. Certainly other priorities such as the economy right now might be more important to Russians. And in general, Europe sort of stands out compared to much of the world. Western Europe stands out compared to much of the world as making, in terms of making democratic features a priority.
On freedom of speech, you indicate a global median of 80%, with Americans with 95%. The Americans are also the ones which are the bigger critics of their government, with 95%. Applies this also in cases like Snowden?
Well, what we see in the U.S. is that in general, there's typically more support for free expression on all sorts of different fronts than maybe you see in other countries around the world. So we ask people about should people be allowed to criticize their government? Should they be able to make statements that may be seen as offensive to minorities or to religious groups? In the U.S., people are willing to say at a higher level than you see in other parts of the world, yes, I think that people should be allowed to say those things, and the government shouldn't censor those kinds of statements. So in general, the U.S. is a little bit more supportive of free expression than others around the world. Now you mentioned Snowden. One exception to this pattern is that in the U.S., more so than, say, in Europe, people are willing to say, I think it's okay for the media to be censored on issues of national security. So most Americans say that they're okay with the government censoring the media if it's publishing a story that has sensitive material related to national security. And that's the one exception. That's the area where Americans are maybe a little less supportive of free expression compared to others around the world.
So national security is an issue where the government should prevent publicizing information or disseminating information in the media.
Yeah, this is one where, again, Americans are, and many others around the world as well, are more willing to say there's maybe a role for government to step in some circumstances, limit media freedom. Much more so than, say, for instance, when the media publishes a story that could lead to economic instability. People around the world typically say, they're comfortable with that. And Americans in particular say they're okay with the media publishing those kinds of stories. We ask people whether they're okay with the media publishing stories on large political protests in the country. And generally people say yes. But when it comes to national security, people see that a little bit differently.
Applies this also to scandals such as the Volkswagen, for instance, scandal? Because here is also a very sensitive issue. It's probably hundreds of jobs will be lost because of the scandal.
Yeah. Well, in the sense that stories like that tie into the potential for economic instability, then what we find in the survey is generally people are willing to say, that's okay, I'm comfortable with the media publishing that kind of story, even if it has some negative economic fallout. They don't see a role for government to step in those kind of situations and stop the media from publishing that kind of material.
But this can also cause political instability, security, actually.
Well, if it turned into a security issue, then people might see it a little bit differently. But that's really about national security and threats to the national security rather than the economic security. So people see those things a little bit differently.
Mr. Wike, thank you so much for this interview.
Great, thank you.